Okay, welcome to lesson 2.7, part 1 of the Civil War. Today's objective is to be able to explain how the Civil War was caused by slavery and the question of whether or not states had the right to allow slavery. And our lesson question for 2.7 is what caused the Civil War? I am going to be using some new terms that some of you may not have heard before. So I'll quickly define those. Union means the United States of America, united under the Constitution. It's also called the North. The Confederacy is the Confederate States of America, the group that tried to break apart from the United States, also called the South. An abolitionist, we've talked about once or twice before, but an abolitionist was someone who wanted to end slavery altogether. Legislation is another word for a law. Congress is the people who make laws for the United States. It includes the Senate and the House of Representatives. We'll talk more about that in our next unit. And then secession means withdrawing or officially breaking away, no longer being a member. All right, so thinking about the causes of the Civil War, it really starts with slavery and the institution of slavery, which we've talked about many times already. Um, Going all the way back to 1820, there was a deal struck in Congress called uh, the Missouri Compromise, which happened in 1820, Missouri Compromise. And the Missouri Compromise um, surrounded the fact that the United States now had all this new land as a result of the Louisiana Purchase. Um, and the question was whether new states in this territory would be able to allow slavery or not. Would they be free states or slave states? Under the Missouri Compromise of 1820, Missouri was admitted to the United States as a slave state, meaning they could allow slavery, and Maine was admitted as a free state, meaning they could not allow slavery. And the Missouri Compromise of 1820 drew this line across something called the 36th parallel, a line of latitude, that said basically that any new state that joined the US in the future that was south of that line could be a slave state, and any new state that was north of that line would be a free state. Okay, and this was significant because it basically officially divided the United States between North and South, with the North being free and the South being slave states. Okay, and this really only heightened tensions, increased tensions between the North and the South, particularly with the abolitionists in the North and the pro slavery people in the South. Throughout the period of 1820 onwards, there was this sort of growing sense of abolitionist movement or a growing abolitionist movement where more and more people became stronger against slavery. Okay, they wanted to end slavery altogether. A clear example of that was this book published in 1852 called Uncle Tom's Cabin, um, in which the author Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote this book basically illustrating how bad slavery was for everyone involved, including especially the slaves. And that book sold millions of copies. It was one of the best selling books in American history at the time. Um, and it, again, increased the abolitionist sentiment in the North. Okay, more and more people read that book, saw how bad slavery was, and decided that slavery was wrong and should be done away with altogether. Meanwhile, between 1820 and 1852, and I believe it was 1831, there was a rebellion called Nat Turner's Rebellion. Okay, 1831, Nat Turner's Rebellion. Nat Turner was a slave in Virginia who rebelled along with many other slaves on his plantation and on several other nearby plantations. It was a rebellion whereby slaves on these plantations rose up and killed plantation owners, overseers, other pro slavery people who tried to intervene. There was a lot of people who died during Nat Turner's rebellion, including when Nat Turner was captured. He, as the leader of this rebellion, was put to death as well. Okay, and that is another example highlighting sort of these rising tensions between pro-slavery and anti-slavery people in the United States. Okay, the pro-slavery people saw this rebellion and basically got scared at how much anti-slavery sentiment there was. Northerners, abolitionists, saw this rebellion as sort of a good thing, okay, a positive step towards eliminating slavery. And these tensions and this abolitionist sentiment grew um, in the North so much that after the Mexican American War, which we just got done talking about, where the United States acquired more new land in the Southwest, there was a provision that was proposed called the Wilmot Proviso. And what this guy Wilmot proposed was that every territory that was acquired as a result of the Mexican American War would not be allowed to have slavery. Okay, all of those new territories, if they were going to join the United States, would have to be free states. Um, the Wilmot Proviso failed. Okay, this was in, I think it was 1846 to 48 was the discussion about the Wilmot Proviso. It failed because um, Southerners, okay, because people in the South, pro-slavery people, wanted this new territory that was south of the 36th parallel. They wanted those new territories to be admitted to the United States as slave states. Okay, so the Wilmot Proviso failed because of the Missouri Compromise of 1820. However, um, it was an example of official Northern policy against slavery. Okay, Northerners officially took a stand against expanding slavery into new territories, which would help lead to some of the events we'll talk about on the next slide and eventually lead to the Civil War. Now, after the Wilmot Proviso failed in 1850, um, there was a compromise reached between the Northerners who were against slavery and the Southerners who were pro-slavery. This Compromise of 1850 admitted California to the United States as a free state. And in exchange for that, the South was allowed to basically expand slavery into the new territories gained by the Mexican American War. Okay, so it was a compromise because the Northerners gained this state of Florida um, as a free state, and the Southerners were allowed to um, move into these Southwest territories. And if they were going to become part of the United States, they could be slave states. And this map right here shows you this sort of light blue color right here were states that were territory that was opened to slavery. Okay, meaning that if states in those territories became part of the US, they could have slavery. The other very important thing that the Compromise of 1850 did was pass something called the Fugitive Slave Act. And this was really something that was seen as a huge negative for abolitionists and anti slavery people in the North. Okay, the Fugitive Slave Act said that if a slave escaped, let's say a slave escaped from Virginia, for example, and escaped into a northern state like New York or Pennsylvania. The Fugitive Slave Act said that anybody in New York or Pennsylvania or any other state would be required to help capture that slave and return them to their plantation or wherever they were from in the South. Okay, so it basically made Northerners who were against slavery participate in slavery by forcing them to capture runaway slaves and return them to their owners in the South. Obviously, for anti slavery people, this was a big deal. Okay, and they did not like the Fugitive Slave Act. Again, increasing tensions between pro slavery and anti slavery people during this time here in 1850 leading up to the Civil War. Here in the bottom right, you see an example of a newspaper clipping that came into be after the Fugitive Slave Act, requesting people to find runaway slaves and return them to where they came from. Okay, soon after the Compromise of 1850, there was a piece of legislation passed called the Kansas Nebraska Act in 1854, and it split this territory right here into two separate soon to be states, Nebraska in the north and Kansas right to the south of Nebraska. And part of the Kansas Nebraska Act said that it had this idea of popular sovereignty, which basically meant that the people who moved into Kansas and Nebraska, the Americans who moved into Kansas and Nebraska, could vote for themselves whether to allow slavery in their state, in their new state, or not. Okay. On the surface, that might seem like part of American democracy. People could vote for their laws. However, what happened as a result of the Kansas Nebraska Act and this idea of popular sovereignty was you had many people from the South moving into Kansas at the same time that many people from the North were moving into Kansas, and those two were moving into these new states to basically get enough votes to vote their way. Okay, the Northerners moving into Kansas wanted enough people to vote against slavery. The Southerners moving into Kansas wanted to get enough people to vote for slavery. Those two groups of people clashed in something that became known as Bleeding Kansas, where those two groups actually started fighting with each other, killing one another over this idea, this question of whether Kansas should be a free state or a slave state. Okay, and this is a very stark example, a very strong example of how the tensions between pro-slavery and anti-slavery people were about to break into all-out fighting and all-out war. One famous individual who moved into Kansas during this Bleeding Kansas period was a man named John Brown, which we'll talk a little bit um, more about later. And you'll have your parlay discussion about John Brown this week. Okay, a few years later, we had a Supreme Court case. Okay, next cause of the Civil War was this Supreme Court case, Dred Scott versus Sanford. This is Dred Scott right here. He was a slave whose master moved into free territory. Okay, Dred Scott's owner moved from Missouri, which was a slave state, into Illinois and Wisconsin, which were free states. And Dred Scott argued, he sued for his freedom, claimed that he was free because he had been brought into free states, Illinois and Wisconsin. And because he was present in these free states where slavery was illegal, he was free when he entered those states. Okay, that's what Dred Scott claimed. That case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where this guy right here, Roger B. Taney, you might hear some people pronounce his last name Taney, but Roger B. Taney wrote the opinion of the Supreme Court, the decision, and the outcome was that the Supreme Court said Dred Scott was wrong. Okay, not only was he wrong in that he wasn't free, but Roger Taney also said that Black Americans in general were not citizens of the United States. Even free blacks, non slave blacks, were not citizens of the United States and therefore couldn't sue on their own behalf. Okay, they didn't have the right to sue. They didn't have the rights that other white Americans had. And this was, again, another example that galvanized abolitionists in the North. Okay, this was a terrible decision. It's gone down in history as probably the worst decision in United States Supreme Court history. It galvanized abolitionists in the North. It made them stronger in their belief that they needed to do something to end this institution of slavery because it was now damaging all Black Americans, not just slaves in the South, but all Black Americans who, under this Dred Scott ruling, didn't have rights as citizens of the United States. You will learn a little bit more about the Dred Scott decision in your Nearpod activity. But to summarize, key point number one from the first couple of slides. From the 1830s on, there was this growing belief in abolition, okay, abolition of slavery, meaning people wanting to get rid of slavery, especially in the northern states. At the same time that there was this growing abolitionist movement, Americans became divided over whether or not new states could be allowed. Oops, could be allowed to own slavery. Okay, divided over whether new states could be allowed to um, have slavery in these states. Key court cases such as the Dred Scott case and pieces of legislation such as the Kansas Nebraska Act, all of these things combined to increase tensions between pro slavery and anti slavery people in the United States. Okay, so starting in 1854, In response to the Kansas Nebraska Act, a new political party emerged called the Republican Party. Okay, and the Republican Party was founded basically in opposition to the Kansas Nebraska Act and this idea that slavery could be allowed to expand into new Western territories. Okay, the Republicans were against expanding slavery, and their up and coming star of the Republican Party was a man named Abraham Lincoln, which we'll talk about in the next slide. Um, but that the rise of the Republican Party um, again was an example of how it became official policy of people in the North, especially, to oppose slavery and to oppose the expansion of slavery into new territories. So it became official policy of many Northerners and abolitionists. And this guy here on the left is John Brown. Not only was it official policy of abolitionists to oppose slavery, there were individuals like John Brown who did things, okay, took actions to oppose slavery as well. Now, John Brown is an interesting character because he opposed slavery in a very violent way. I mentioned him earlier in relation to Bleeding Kansas. He and several of his sons moved into Kansas to oppose slavery in Bleeding Kansas. They took part in some of the violence that occurred in Kansas. And then a few years later, in 1859, John Brown led a raid on Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. Okay, he led this raid on Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, and his goal during this raid was to incite a slave rebellion. And the way he was going to incite this slave rebellion was by stealing guns and ammunition from the federal government in Harper's Ferry. Okay, there was this ammunition storehouse in Harper's Ferry. John Brown and some of his followers, I think there were 18 of them total, broke into this government storehouse of guns and ammunition in order to try to steal those guns, bring them to slaves around the South, and incite this rebellion where they would, since they now had guns, could rise up and basically fight their way out of slavery, killing their masters, killing their owners, killing people who would try to capture them. So John Brown is this example of individuals starting to be willing to fight to end slavery, while at the same time it became official policy, governmental policy in the North to oppose slavery as well. John Brown was eventually caught. Okay, he was trapped inside this storehouse as he tried to steal the guns. He was caught and sentenced to death. But many Northerners, many abolitionists saw this as sort of the first step towards fighting, actually fighting against slavery. And we'll see that in 2 years from this point, in 1861, um, the Civil War broke out, and it wasn't just John Brown and people who followed him who were fighting against slavery. It was the entire country fighting over this question of slavery. Now, Southerners obviously didn't like this idea that there were people such as John Brown who were starting to actually do things to fight against them, kill slave owners in the South, and so on and so forth. The last straw that sort of broke the camel's back here, leading to the Civil War, was the election of Abraham Lincoln right here in 1860. Okay, the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president of the United States. Abraham Lincoln wasn't a strong abolitionist. Okay, he didn't necessarily want to end slavery altogether. However, he was very strong in his belief that slavery should not be expanded into new Western territories. Okay, so he opposed slavery um, being allowed in new territories, one after the Mexican American War and the Louisiana Purchase. And Southerners viewed Abraham Lincoln as a threat to expanding slavery. Okay. And so, in response to the 1860 election, South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union. Okay, remember, seceding means formally withdrawing or breaking away from. South Carolina seceded from the United States in December of 1860. Okay, so basically 1 month after Abraham Lincoln was elected president, South Carolina said, "This is the last straw. we are no longer part of the United States. In total, 11 states, so 10 other states in the South would secede along with South Carolina, and they would try to form their own government called the Confederate States of America. And what that did, what that did was make any United States forts that were now in these southern states. It made these forts outposts in a foreign land. Okay, so there was this fort right here in the middle called Fort Sumter that was in South Carolina. It was an American fort, a fort of the United States. That when South Carolina broke away from the United States, it became this sort of outpost in a quote unquote foreign land in the Confederate States of America. And so when the United States went to send supplies to reinforce Fort Sumter, the Confederate States sent their warships to block those supplies, and then the Confederate Army bombarded Fort Sumter. And this was the first fire, okay, the first battle of the Civil War. The Confederate States fired the first shots of the Civil War against the United States fort called Fort Sumter in South Carolina. And this was in early 1861. Let me write that date up there because you'll need to remember 1861 was the start of the Civil War. That's when the first shots were fired. So, quickly review our key points. Key point number one, from the 1830s onwards, there was this growing belief in the abolition of slavery, especially in the North. At the same time, Americans were becoming more and more divided over whether new states could allow slavery or not. Um, Key point number two, the creation of the Republican Party as this sort of anti slavery party and the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 as president were the final straws that led to the secession of many southern states, 11 in total. And that led to the first battle, the first shots fired in the Civil War at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. Okay, what's next? You have a Nearpod lesson. In that lesson, you'll analyze a short video clip about the Dred Scott decision and then respond to a question about the impact of that decision. When you're done with that, please review the lesson question so you're ready for the mastery check in Google Classroom.